There was a single moment in June 1999 that completely changed my view of the world. I was living and working in the UK, and I'd become involved with a small children's charity, and they offered to send me out to Asia to see where the money was being spent and the good work that was being done. It was my first trip to an emerging market, and I would have been completely lost on my own. And luckily the charity knew this. They provided me with a guide. He was a young guy, smart, funny, about my age. Our days were normally full of visits to orphanages and schools to see what was happening and meeting the kids and volunteers. And on this day, we were changing locations at around lunchtime. Without thinking, I took us into McDonald's. We went in, I went to the counter, ordered our food, and then sat down. And that's when I realized my companion was doing something strange. He took one small bite of his burger, ate a couple of fries and a sip of his Coke, and then carefully wrapped everything up again and put it in his bag. He asked, did I mind if he took it back to his house to share with his brothers and sisters so they could experience what McDonald's tasted like? I didn't know what to say. I was stunned. For me, McDonald's had been the definition of accessibility. Anybody could go there, and I presumed it was the same for everybody else in the world, but I was wrong. For my companion, going into McDonald's meant overcoming a number of barriers that to me were invisible, poverty and social status. But for other people, those barriers are the ramp. It's the cost. It's the ability to even read the menu. 96% of brands say that they intend to be more inclusive and empathetic, but only 5% have done anything about it. It's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity to engage these marginalized consumers. If you're developing a new product, would you create packaging that was easy to read and easy to understand, or impossible for billions of people? More altruistically, if you want to engage marginalized groups of people, do you go after the small, loud groups, or the bigger groups of billions of people currently suffering in silence? My name's Stephen McGuinness. I'm a design industry veteran, and over the last 20 years, I've developed and launched multiple brands for the big players around the world. But now my passion is in radical inclusivity, of destroying those barriers between your brand and those billions of people that are currently underserved by it, and unlocking trillions of dollars of commercial opportunity. This is the chance to be on the right side of history. And it's not just a nice thing to do, it's the commercially smart thing to do. Whether it's emerging markets like here in Thailand, where I'm based, the fast-moving markets of Northern Asia, or the developed markets of the West, billions of people engage with your brands and products every single day. Now, some of them might visit your website. Some of them might see an advert or look at your social media. Some of them might even hear that smart, flattering thing that a social influencer was paid to say about you. But most won't. No, most consumers will interact with your packaging, whether they're future or existing. Your packaging works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's the single most powerful touch point you have. But in terms of inclusivity, most brands, you're just dropping the ball. Now, I know times are tough and many of the right things to do have been shelved, but radical inclusivity isn't a nice to do. It's the commercially smart thing to do when you think of the trillions of dollars left on the table. You're missing out on opportunity of an untapped global market. Design helps us produce materials that are accessible to as many people with a wider range of abilities as possible. But radical inclusive design ensures that that activity not only promotes inclusivity, but to as wide a number of people as possible, and in the most effective way possible to deliver an ROI in commercial terms for the brand. Let's give some examples of that scale. In the US alone, 12 million have hearing problems, 25 million live in poverty, and 42 million are visually challenged, with 46 million people being functionally illiterate, and English not being the first language for 72 million. And then when we think globally, the numbers become staggering. 500 million have hearing problems, 3 billion live in poverty, and 1 billion are visually challenged. 1.5 billion are functionally illiterate, and English isn't the first language for 7 billion. Now, most brands are marginalizing those consumers because we aren't those consumers. We see things from our own perspective. We imagine the world sees the things from our perspective too, and that's the problem. Frank Lloyd Wright once said, if I was 2 inches taller, my buildings would look different. That's because architecture, like design or any communication, is autobiographical. We project our abilities and perceptions onto everybody else. But when we realize that's not accurate in terms of individuals, and it's certainly not accurate in terms of the market at large. I'm able-bodied, got good eyesight, some money in my pocket, and are able to read and write with a degree of confidence. But most people in the world don't have all of those attributes. And by expecting the world to be like us, we're marginalizing and missing out on the billions of people that aren't. So what we see as being the norm, even just in numbers, is actually the minority. So we need to think about those masses of people that are living marginalized existences and look at how to engage them. So let's take 3 examples today. People living in poverty, people with literacy challenges, and first, the visually impaired. More than 1 billion people in the world already suffer from some kind of visual impairment. And as the global population ages, that's going to go up and up. In fact, everyone over 40 suffers from some degree of visual deterioration, and people over 60 are twice as likely to suffer from a serious visual impairment. Let's talk about some of the most common complaints. People with cataracts or glaucoma experience darkening of what they see or level of focus that makes it hard to understand small typefaces and color contrasts. And anything that isn't front and center in the packaging or the POS will be lost in the blurs around the edges. People who are colorblind make up 10% of the population, and that may seem little more than an inconvenience, but when so many brands use color as a means to navigate across a portfolio, it makes finding the right product very difficult for a lot of people. We've identified the 25 most common blockers that get between shoppers and your brands visually, and the solutions to those. A design team that understands those principles can implement this optimization simply and effectively into a brand refresh or a brand design in a way that doesn't impact category cues or even the overall aesthetic. And ideally, it gets built into the foundation of a new brand identity. Visual inclusive optimized design is probably the single most effective thing you could do to your brands right now. Around the world, 3 billion people live in what the World Health Organization describes as poverty, and that's across developed and emerging nations. Now, unsurprisingly, if you're worried about where your next meal's coming from or where your family's going to sleep tonight, you're going to make different decisions than people who have more economic security. So that could be about small things like a toothpaste choice or bigger things like opening a bank account. But what we do know that when faced with longer term challenges and opportunities, people will tend to focus towards the things that give them immediate benefits. So simply put, someone who's worried about sustenance doesn't worry about sustainability. And when I was working in Indonesia, I discovered that toothpastes that talked about immediate benefits, such as white teeth and fresh breath, always outsold the ones talking about the longer term benefits, such as cavities or teeth retention. But in other locations and other categories, it's the reverse. If you're relying on one set of clothes for the needs of several generations of children, it may be that the washing powder that talks about long-term protection is more appealing than the one that gets it whiter right now. And if your family relies on one scooter for its life and livelihood, then keeping that scooter functioning long-term with performance versus protection is going to be much more appealing to you. And of course, on the bigger picture, how you frame things is very important. For you, what might be a budget or a small purchase For other people, it could be a special treat they've been looking forward to. So I'm not suggesting making cheaper products or even dropping the prices of existing products, but it's about thinking about how you communicate and how you prioritize the messages for the products you already have, and see this huge, relatively untapped demographic as an opportunity to be embraced. When you can't read the words, you're relying on what something looks like to make your decisions. I remember being a teenager traveling across Europe by train. I was down to my last few dollars in France and I was famished. I stopped at a small store and bought 2 big baguettes and a large jar of chicken pate. I took my feast to the park to enjoy what to me was going to be a banquet. I was so disappointed. Turned out my jar of chicken pate was actually super strong French mustard. The picture on the jar of a baguette with chicken in was a serving suggestion, not a product descriptor. I was so disappointed I could have cried. In fact, I think I might have cried. But we do it all the time. We regularly put images on packs and POS of things that aren't in the pack. We put it there for aesthetics, we put it there for appetite appeal, or simply sometimes to fill the space. But it's confusing and disappointing to people who buy the product that they didn't want. Or it loses customers who want your product but don't know what it is because the image doesn't match. It's simple. Why don't we just have on the pack pictures of what's inside the pack? Icons can give your brand a feeling of expertise and leadership, science or technology. They can make communicating key messages or instructions easier. But to be truly effective, they must be freestanding. If an icon has to have a piece of text next to it to explain what it means, the icon's redundant. Just have the text. An icon needs to be understandable without the need for additional written information. Now that's harder to do, but otherwise, why bother? Finally, let's talk copywriting. As we talked about, we design in an autobiographical way, but we speak and write from our own perspective too. We use terms, phrases and words we assume everyone understands. We use jargon without realizing it, we use acronyms without explaining what the letters stand for, and we use technical info that makes no sense to the average person. We forget that the common colloquialisms and metaphors that we use in everyday communication, even within a common language, are culturally specific and not understood by many people. Do you really go after low-hanging fruit, let the cat out of the bag, or lead a horse to water? No, they're colloquial metaphors, and most of the world have got no understanding what they mean. Vitally important is reading level comprehension. Aside from the billions of people who can't read copy at all, how many are struggling with your choice of words? The average American adult has the reading age of a 7th grader. That's 11 to 12 years old. Now that's the average. So half the population read at a lower level than that. In Britain, it's between 9 and 10 years old. Disappointing when you consider we invented the language. But the good news is writing simple, easy to understand copy is actually more effective, regardless of the ability of the reader. Now that's counterintuitive. We tend to think sophisticated writing is superior, but it turns out it's not the case. First of all, who doesn't want easy to understand information? I know I do. Second, analysis of the writing of some of the world's greatest authors with the Fleisch-Kincaid test showed that those who wrote more simply and clearly were more successful, critically and commercially. Ernest Hemingway dealt with rich, multi-layered concepts and created complex characters, but wrote at the level of a 4th grader. That's a 9-year-old. Stephen King and Dan Brown write at the level of an 11-year-old. Remember what Einstein said, any fool can make things more complicated. So what do you do now? First of all, don't be satisfied with well-meaning rhetoric anymore. Those worn-out platitudes we're using over and over again, but we're not turning into action. We all agree that these things should happen. Now it's time to do them. We talk about inclusion, we talk about removing barriers, and we talk about universal design, and no one disagrees with that. But those words don't become action enough. Those warm and fuzzy corporate statements, they're about as much use as social media likes. You can do this. Embrace radical inclusivity and make a positive change commercially and do the right thing. Making your brand or your business even fractionally more inclusive is good for you, your brand, your business, and billions of people. So, let's get started.